Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of Between the Worlds podcast. My name, as you know, is Raven, and I'm joined by co host Jackie from Me, My Skirt, and I. Uh, Say hi to the audience, Jackie.
Hi, audience.
So, for those of you not aware, I've been saying on the channel for a while that I've wanted to start a podcast, but I'm not someone who can just talk to a wall and be very entertaining. So, I thought, let me find someone who's just as into the Cosmere and fantasy as I am, does similar content, and Jackie and I have been talking. We did a bit of a test episode a while back, and so here we are. And in today's episode, this being the first one, we'll just be exploring some of our top favorite Cosmere books, what we like about them, what we don't like about them, and just having a bit of a discussion. So I'm going to give the floor over to you, Jackie, to start us off with one of your favorite books and we can get the discussion going.
So, I have to say that one of my first favorite Cosmere book is The Emperor's Soul. It's a novella set in the Elantris world, and it was not where I started the Cosmere, but after Mistborn broke my heart in to a billion tiny, tiny pieces, I never wanted to read something like that again. But I saw The Emperor's Soul on the library shelf, and I decided to give Sanderson one more shot with this Cosmere thing. And it ended up being just like the most heartwarming, like bittersweet story that really gave me faith in the Cosmere again. So that has a special place in my heart because if I hadn't read that book, I never would have returned to the Cosmere, and my entire life would be very different right now.
I actually really enjoyed The Emperor's Soul. I only read it after Elantris, but when I read it, I was like, okay, I'm unashamed to say that Elantris is not my favorite Cosmere book, but when I read Emperor's Soul, I was like, okay, Cell is now one of my favorite Cosmere worlds, and this short story deserves to be its own novel. I don't know if Sanderson's ever going to go for a full novel set in that same setting with those characters, but man, I also really enjoyed it, especially just how personal the story feels. It's like it's this deep exploration of this character and her relationship with essentially what is her jailer. But I don't know. It's Sanderson sometimes has this way of just writing characters that just warms the heart.
Yeah, like it's it's actually a book. It's a book that I actually read in physical print, and one thing that I've learned in this crazy booktube experience is that I really skim when I read, so like unless it's read to me in audiobook. So like the fact that the story itself was able to still convey I remember like her at the end and like working with the emperor and then running into her jail the councilwoman and like being so moved by that, even though like this is probably one of the stories that I have like the least detailed memory of what actually happens in the book. um and yeah, I was intrigued by it because I, for school, ended up studying Taiwan. And on the back cover, it says that, like, Sanderson went to Taiwan and was inspired by the culture. So I'm like, I like this culture. I want to see, like, what Sanderson does with this culture in a fantasy setting. And it's only a novella, so I can uh, it's not too big of a time investment. And then like next thing I know, I was tearing up, and it it just sneaks in there and is so great. But like the drawbacks of it are that it is a novella and it is very like it still has multiple perspectives, but it's such a small story and like you miss the now that I know that Sanderson can create large worlds full of life and not just sludge, like I want to see that part of this of Cell as well and not just like what was essentially it began just a stone room, but by the end like she had a nice like coffee table in there and how like industrious she was. That was really cool to see.
Yeah, what I really like is when Sanderson writes these characters that are, I don't know how to describe them, but it's characters that are extremely competent. Like she is, like she knows exactly what she's doing when it comes to forgery. She's clearly well trained, but at the same time, she's basically using it to commit crimes. You have the same theme in Mistborn, for example. I don't think you have it in Stormlight or in Warbreaker or anything, but I really like when he has these people who are essentially good people, kind-hearted people who care about others around them, but because of their life and their circumstances, they use these specific set of skills that they've kind of mastered to give a kind of a middle finger to the society they grew up in. I mean, if I have my lore correct, her homeland is essentially a province of the Rose Empire, which is kind of enslaved them in a way. So I really enjoy that, and I feel like Sanderson does lean into the rebellious character archetype quite a lot.
Yeah, he can. Shay is the forger, and I don't know if like she was if her I can't remember if her people they were probably colonized because it's Sanderson. And like I really do in some ways like have always connected with the character versus like society and the world. Like Robin Hood was my favorite character was one of my favorite characters. And like finding like the noble thief is just one of my favorite tropes and that like she's and that Sanderson sets it up so well that she's doing it to get back at this system that doesn't treat her well, but she's not spiteful. She's not Moash. She's not there to watch the world burn. She just wants to carve out a place for herself in society, and the fact that society doesn't has rules against that, against what she wants to do, she just doesn't follow those rules. But she still cares about other people. She still wants to see the emperor rule well. And she works to help better society by understanding the emperor and how he got to his position with assassins coming in the night, and tries to inspire him through her art to be a better emperor. And so it's like she wants society to do well, but where society is failing, she just doesn't let that stop her. And that's a really cool character that I love in any position, in any story. But Sanderson wrote that so incredibly well in The Emperor's Soul.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think I'll move on to the one of my favorites. It's also actually it's not even a novella. It's a short story from Arcanum Unbounded. I don't know if it has a novella form, but and I'm not sure if you've read it. But Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. Have you read that one?
Yes, I've been waiting for a good time to review it, but yeah, that was hardcore.
Yeah, that has got to be one of my favorite snippets into a Cosmere story of all time. I just love the setting, I love the magic, I love the characters, the story they went through. It it literally got so stuck in my head after reading it that, and me being a writer myself, I was just constantly thinking like, damn, I want to use some of these elements myself. It was just so well done. I love the shadows that they used in the story. I love the twist at the end with it being Silence's grandmother. All of that, the whole that it's a frontier type situation where they can't return to their homeland and all of that. It's just the whole setting and the story itself, and the fact that Sanderson, as we know, can do horror elements so well. I don't know. I think it's definitely one of my favorite Cosmere stories, and I want to do more content on it. It's just that there really isn't much to dive into because it is such a short story.
Yeah, I do love like the pioneer. It's like pioneer settings are so hard like to sell me. Um, my mom had a thing for westerns growing up, so like I have seen every single John Wayne movie except for the Cowboys, um, and many other spaghetti westerns. And so I'm kind of like they're from my perspective, like they're overdone. I often view them as overdone. It's like, oh, I've seen this before, and um, so like I was coming into it like it's like the opposite of like I was not set up, I was not predisposed towards this trope in any way, and that he was still able to get me invested in the characters, and it's like the two women trying to make it work on the frontier is probably more of a common news story and not necessarily like those cowboy stories from the 1960s that I ended up growing up with. But for me, it was still, this was a new story with new characters trying something different. And like horror cowboy is not something that you really also saw in the 1960s cowboy films. And because he talks about how he wanted to show a different kind of woman's strength. And as a female reader, I love truly strong female characters that aren't just, I am a strong female because I do everything like a man would do. And it's very encouraging for me to see Sanderson dive into the Ma character and her maternalness, her femininity, and make that her point of strength, and her relationship with her grandmother, as unorthodox as that is, and make that her strength, and not because like she wears pants and carries a revolver.
You know what? You actually make a really good point. And look, Sanderson, he writes characters of all different types, and while I really enjoy Silence because of, she's a strong female character, but she's a strong female character because she's strong in a feminine way, because she's not doing everything like a man. And then you have, for example, one of the fandom's favorite, Yasna from Stormlight Archive. I've got no issue with Yasna. I don't mind her as a character, no problem, but she very much also feels like the kind of character where she's a strong woman because she argues like a man, she can fight like a man, and it's like, you don't always have to have that dynamic when you're writing strong female characters. Men and women are strong in different ways, and highlighting that through storytelling is, I think, should be the goal of every writer.
Yeah, I think that I have lots of thoughts on Yasna and don't want to go off on, don't want to undercut Silence and like all of my thoughts on Yasna, but I do think that she is a character yet to be explored, and I think that Sanderson is going to play with her like masculine and feminine traits further down the road. I don't think he's done with her yet. And
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I'm sure there's still a lot of development that's gonna happen on her side as well. I was just making an example, and we'll of course probably touch on her in a future episode. But
Mm-hmm.
coming back to Silence, I really, like I said, I really enjoy her as a character. But what I also like about the story is the setting as well. It's the whole idea of it being a frontier, but it's the society that made a frontier out of a world that essentially at all times wants to kill you, and you basically need to mine precious metals just to make a little place to survive. It's like, why would you even go there? And then but they did, and now they can't even go back. And it's that essentially they're just struggling for survival. There's no real future for them on that place to really expand or thrive. But at the same time, they can't go back to the homeland. So I also really like that conflict of it as well.
Yeah, the fact that this is such a short story, but Sanderson put the time and effort into building the backstory as to why are these people living in a haunted woods where everything wants to kill them, like is something that is very it's something that I Sanderson is so good at, whereas I in other stories where like oh they're in this place that wants to kill them for generic like we want to get the treasure, we want to like or we're just here because we're here, um and like the fact that like Sanderson takes the time in I don't know if it's technically like in the story itself or if it's in like the Arcanum Unbounded little snippet right before that kind of explains like this is the world's history and then goes into the story, but like it's still a part of like the history, even if that was in like in a separate like article, like still is evident throughout the story and explains why the base character motivations, not only about why they live there, but why she's doing what she's doing and how she became dependent on it's not her landlord or it's her the guy who she owes the money to. Like it makes sense in the bigger scope of the world that he establishes very quickly but very detailed.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And definitely one of my favorite stories. I hope that we at some point get at least more of a story, if not with Silence, in the world at the very least, because I'm really interested in it. But yeah, what is your next book on the list?
I'm gonna go to, I guess a more mainstream one is Warbreaker. On the I well, according to like the entire fandom, I read Warbreaker at the wrong time. I read it after the Stormlight. I had read through book 3 of the Stormlight Archive and then went back to Warbreaker, and it like it kind of does suffer from an early Sanderson book. He's wordy. He puts like the climax at the end of the last or the end of the last chapter. Like very little falling action, in which both those things just drive me crazy. But at the heart of it, it's the retelling of Eros and Psyche, which is a Greek myth that, like, in high school, sometime in high school, I bought Bullfinch's myth, anthology of mythology because I thought that's what smart people read instead of fantasy. This is kind of the beginning of me getting away from fantasy, and I was really struck by like the Beauty and the Beast style tale. Disney princesses. This is were a big part of my growing up. And so it really struck with me of like, oh, this is this fun. It's not truly a romance book, but it's a story about two characters falling in love. balanced with a mostly realistic geopolitical conflict with undead zombie armies walking around. It's like, what's not to love about any of that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, Warbreaker has to be my favorite standalone fantasy novel that I've read in a while. And for me, it's what I really enjoy as well is it's the setting. You know, he essentially creates a society that thrives off of what is generally considered to be necromancy, but he does it in a way where it's usually in most fantasy stories, necromancy and things of that nature are frowned upon. They are considered evil and dark arts. And here you have this thriving, colorful society that essentially relies upon and normalizes the use of what is the corpses of loved ones. I mean, I can't remember if I've got this right, but Claude, the lifeless that Vivenna
Mhm.
gets to know, is like the brother or something of one of the mercenaries, the female. It's been a while since I've read it, but I'm like, they
Uh,
I don't want to say that they have no respect for the bodies of their dead, but that's kind of what it implies.
um, they're the in a word of Brandon that I recall, I can't look like so. If anyone wants to double check and look this up, I think the female had a crush. They were not related. She had a female. The female had Jules was the female who had a crush on Claude when he was alive, but was not reciprocated. So it's I think Brandon has said in one of his words of Brandon that Jules takes advantage of Claude as a in a physical way when since he is now dead and she can order him to do what she wants. And that I think he also goes on to say that Jules is not in a healthy spot in her life at this moment. And it's
Wow.
very disrespectful to the body. Um,
Wow. Okay, we went from exploring colorful necromancy to essentially necrophilia. I didn't even know that. Wow.
yeah, Brandon says the strangest things, but it fits in where like one of the things that Brandon does is he incorporates dark and disgusting and disturbing like things into his story, but he doesn't the story is always about overcoming them. Jules is an antagonist, and even if it's presented in one of our main characters, like doing discussing things, that's like something that is they strive to overcome, and more often than not, do overcome it. And like, I think a lot of like of one of the things that like I was hearing when I was getting out of fantasy is that fantasy has to be like dark and grim and happy endings are um childish and stupid and we can't have that in our quote unquote realistic fantasy. And I think that Warbreaker is a really great example of there are real dark and disturbing things here, but that doesn't mean that beauty and color and life and the God giving up his life to save the nation is all is also part of that world, and those are really beautiful things. And Sanderson's ability to balance those in Warbreaker, among other of his works, is one of the things that I really do like about him, and that's one of the reasons that like I kept reading, even though it's not like the perfect book.
Yeah, I mean, Warbreaker does have its fault. I mean, like you said, it's got that early Sanderson thing of, the climax is like in the last chapter, and for me, one of my personal issues with Warbreaker, even though I really enjoyed it as a book, is it's basically just the fact that the final political conflict with the Pankal, and that being the rebellion that they were starting, and they were the ones behind the scenes and things like that. I have no issue with that. It's just that it kind of feels like Brandon spent a lot of time setting up other conflicts, and not really foreshadowing the Pankal uprising in any real way. So the ending to me also felt a bit too rushed. It felt like it wasn't exactly very neatly done. But
Hmm.
like I said, I don't really blame him because it was one of his earlier books, and he's definitely gotten a lot better at it. You said you only read it after Oathbringer.
Yeah. Um, I I do not take suspense well. So like Stormlight Archives way, I think because I read it went the Emperor's Soul, Elantris, Way of Kings, and then once I got into the Way of Kings, like I couldn't stop reading the Stormlight Archive. Like I just had to know what happened. And so by the time I found out that I was supposed to have read Warbreaker, I was already like halfway through Oathbringer the first time and was like, oh, well, I guess I will read that soon. Um, and reading it after Oathbringer and like recognizing Vasher as Zio right away did really change like my perspective of the book because like it starts with Zio being like this unknown rogue character, but he starts in a dark place. Like the opening scene is him killing a person. And I talk about this in my review that I got one of my girlfriends to buddy read it with me, although she started before me, and she's like, I kind of like this Vasher character. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. He's kind of gruff and scruffy. He's a likable character. And then I read it and I'm like, he is going around killing people. You have an interesting taste of characters. And so reading it out of order didn't ruin the book for me, but it did like it wasn't necessarily like knowing that Denth was opposed to Vasher. I'm like, okay, Denth is bad news, but Denth's very subtle manipulation of Vivenna still kind of like took me along with him a ways, and I was like, he has a point, and like his betrayal still hurt, even though like I kind of saw it coming generally. But like the specific moment, I was there with Vivenna, just like shocked and terrified as well. And so, like, Sanderson, even though he didn't trick me quite as well as like a first time newbie reader would have been tricked, it was still plenty tricky that I was entertained.
Yeah, I mean, like Vasher, I'm not sure where Brandon is going with Zyle for Stormlight, and apparently we'll see in book 5. But when I first read the book and saw Vasher, I legit thought that if he's not a bad guy, then at the very least he's kind of in the gray area. I actually didn't consider him a good guy until we got the Denth reveal. I was completely hook, line, and sinker captured by Brandon's very masterful use of character manipulation in that instance. You say that it didn't really ruin the book for you, and that's great. I just can't imagine having read the end of Words of Radiance and not having recognized Nightblood, because that for me was such a huge moment.
In like that moment, I was like, "Oh, cool, a talking sword," and like that was kind of exciting enough. for me, but like at the end of Words of Radiance, my main excitement was focused around Kaladin having finally sworn his ideal, the discovery of your Thiru, and like whatever is going on with Shallan, because still don't know. I don't think she knows either. Anyway, um, so like there was so much more to be excited about at the end of Words of Radiance than like, oh, Zeth didn't die and now he has a talking sword. Like that was cool, but I think that having not read Warbreaker and knowing to be excited about this sword, like it kind of like I'm not as big of a Zeth fan as other people in the fandom, probably and maybe part of that is because like I didn't recognize that oh, this character just got handed the Cosmere's nuclear bomb, and interesting things are going to happen um, with him. I was just kind of like, oh, he got a talking sword and he's not dead. I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah, but I
So,
mean, then you get the Battle of Thaylen Field in
oh yeah.
Oathbringer, and then you get to really see just how powerful Nightblood can be, and that's not even talking about End of Rhythm of War.
Mhm.
But before we go on too long on Warbreaker, I'll move on to one of my picks. It is actually a Stormlight book, and it would be Way of Kings. I'm an unashamed Dalinar fan, so in Oathbringer holds a special place in my heart. But if I look at it objectively, I can't say that Oathbringer is a better book than Way of Kings, just because the introduction to this world and to these characters was so masterfully done that it'll probably be one of my top 10 favorite fantasy books of all time. So I just have to throw Way of Kings in here. The whole setting of the world, Roshar with the Spren, and the returning powers of the Knights Radiant, Kaladin on the bridge runs, Dalinar struggling with his visions, and even Shallan trying to con essentially the smartest woman on Roshar. I just really love this book as well.
Well, that was going to be my third choice as well. So, yes, The Way of Kings is just, it's so, like, it's the perfect introduction to the world. It is, like, it does, like, Sanderson just takes you on a journey, and just, like, is a slow, because it's very interesting because I'm working on a book that might get published at some point. And I was like trying to bring the reader. I'm like, I want to start the reader in the mid place, in like middle happy, and then just bring them to their knees by the end of the first act. And then I read The Way of Kings and I was like, yep, that's how you do it. How do I do that in my story? And so I was like seeing this master at work of like get just like getting us so much to love Kaladin, even though he is essentially sitting around and like moping the whole time, um, while being sent on these bridge runs, and then like Shallan is the first, like she's kind of out in like the first part. I'm like, yeah, she's going to be this woman's ward, even though like Yasna says no. It's like, well, this is a freaking huge book. Just because Yasna says no, either the rest of the book she's going to earn it. But I was like the surprising thing was that it was by the end of part one that we did get that closure of yes, she has achieved this wardship and that's cool and great, but now she's going to steal from her. And then the whole idea of like Sanderson's like trilogy within a single book is what I think really helped fix his habit of ending the story on just after a climax. because like part one, yeah, it does sort of is like the first novel, and that does sort of end right after the climax. But then we get part two and part three. And so being able to see Brandon just layer upon layer himself was just so wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, for Way of Kings, just the way that he did Kaladin's depression, like you mentioned. I mean, okay, look, I'm currently going through my reread of A Hero of Ages, and I love Sayzed as much as the next guy, but the difference between how Brandon handled Sayzed's depression with how he handled Kaladin's. uh, there's a reason that a lot of people felt that Sayzed's depression was slow and kind of annoying to read, and I'm going through the same thing. And I'm gonna sound very cynical and rude when I say this, so don't take it the wrong way, but Sayzed's depression is as a result of losing someone that he loved. The problem I have with that is that he basically fell in love with this person over the course of like a couple days in the second book, and that just completely destroyed his worldview. Whereas with Kaladin, I can kind of understand why he would be depressed, having lost, someone very close to him, then being betrayed by the only nobleman that he actually thought had integrity, then being sold into slavery, and then essentially being given a job which is an eventual death sentence, and he could either just jump off of a cliff or keep going until an arrow kills him. So I don't want to say Zed doesn't really have a reason to be depressed, because psychology is very complex, but at the same time, I kind of got to say that Kaladin's was done way better and wasn't annoying at the very least. I was still hooked every chapter. I enjoyed the whole book as well.
Well, yeah, I definitely read Sazed's issues in The Hero of Ages as more of a philosophical crisis of faith than clinical depression. Like, this was a man who had his worldview shattered, but it was more of like slightly deeper than an intellect, like is intellectual in nature and maybe a slightly more, but like um Kaladin is clearly like, I think it's like the show, like the scene where they're collecting lurgs, and he's currently at home with his family. He's with his younger brother. Um, and he's just having a bad day. And it's very clearly, that scene clearly shows that there is something wrong with how his brain works, that like everything can be fine, but he can still be sad, for lack of a better term. And that is what pushed him from just like being your average brooding male protagonist to an above average brooding male protagonist, but he has his own thing going for him. And the other thing that I think that he does really well with Kaladin's arc as opposed to Mistborn is like at the end when Kaladin saves Dalinar, and he reveals his powers to his men, but he doesn't reveal them to Dalinar, as and I think that that seems like a reasonable decision, because we've had this whole story of betrayal by the Light Eyes, cultural um unease with the Knights Radiant, and that he just met Dalinar. And those things are set up so well that it makes sense that he would go on to struggle for an entire another book with, do I tell Dalinar that I have these magical powers? As opposed to in Mistborn, the sequel of Well of Ascension, where Vin is struggling to like tell Ellen all of her problems. And it was like, she's in a romantic relationship with Ellen. She clearly already trusts him, but she just didn't tell him about her problems because she's a teenage girl. Like, it just wasn't that well established as to why she had such a deep trust issue with Elend in in the Mistborn series, as opposed to Kaladin's trauma is so well and naturally established that you're like, yeah, even if I had magical powers that could potentially rocket me up to the top of society, I would still be wary because I've been rocketed up to the top of society before and it didn't end well.
I mean, very true, and that's kind of echoed as well when he's given the opportunity to, claim a shard blade not only once but twice in his life, and both times he declines, and for no other reason than he just doesn't want. Number one, he doesn't want the attention, but number two, the trauma that he received at the hand of the Light Eyes essentially made him see all of them as just these evil, callous people, and it took essentially the whole book of Words of Radiance for him to finally start accepting Light Eyes and understanding that not all of them are evil or bad people. And I don't know, I think Kaladin is probably one of the most complex characters in the Cosmere, and that's definitely why he's one of my favorites as well.
Mm-hmm. I also want to give props to Adolin, the ladies' man in Way of Kings, because like he's written with the correct balance of, yeah, he's a ladies' man. He's probably in real life like a somewhat of a jerk. Um, or to like I probably like if I met him on the street in this stage of his character development would be like I would find him funny to like watch him go around but not like to interact with. Like I would be annoyed if he spoke to me like that. But Sanderson also balances that with making him genuinely try to do the right thing with his father and be supportive of his brother. And Adolin probably has the male gaze, like he probably that's probably at this point how he views women. But like I don't have to read him like ogle every single light-eyed woman on the street. Sanderson keeps what Adolin is thinking about to be strictly plot relevant. And like if he's butchering a relationship, then that's part of it. But it's not just overly like he's not oh what's the private eye. He's not a Jim Butcher character.
Oh yeah, I know you haven't read Era 2 yet, but from what you've said now, you probably will not like one of the main characters, because he essentially, to an extent, does exactly that. But that's just because that's the character he is.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I really enjoy Adolin as well, and I can't actually think of a single character in the Stormlight Archive that I don't like. Maybe with the exception of Venli, but that's just because I have personal issues with just how selfish she was. That's Rhythm of War territory. We won't go into that right now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think I know that we've been going on for a while, and I basically mentioned Way of Kings, which is one of your picks as well. So I think we can actually wrap it up there because I also know you've got somewhere to be. So do you have any final thoughts? Any final things you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Like it was really hard to like narrow it down to three. Like Elantris, I guess, gets the honorable mention because like it it was his first book and it is rough. And I went back and watched my review and I'm like, oh, I actually have very few nice things to actually say about it. but it still stuck with me as a strong story that is just a different way of telling fantasy and having the one of like after Eldon's depression. Well, before Kaladin's depression, we had Raoden's optimism, even though he was also thrust into his world's damnation. And so all of that was very like encouraging for me to see that unlike the Mistborn world where it's like good things can exist, but we are going to kill them in brutal fashion. It was like good things can exist and they can even get happy endings in Sanderson. And seeing that on a whole play out on a whole novel was further encouragement for me to read the rest of the Cosmere, which on its like it's very surprising to me how often Sanderson can just bring us to just the worst place ever, and the worst place ever keeps on getting lower and lower and lower with each of Sanderson's books, but then he ends it on such a high every time that it's totally worth it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're probably gonna I mean, this is just speculation, but I'm pretty sure that in the next Stormlight book we're gonna get some really low lows, especially since it's basically the climax of the first half of Stormlight Archive. So there's gonna be some proper tragic moments. At the very least, that's what I think is gonna happen. But yeah, I mean, this was really fun. I enjoyed having this conversation. For all of you guys watching, we will be doing this on a bi-weekly basis. So another episode will be out in about 2 weeks. All of Jackie's links for her channel, and I'll even put her Twitter and things. I don't know if she really tweets much, but I'll put that all down in the description and in the pinned comment. So do go and subscribe to her as well. She'll be on the channel regularly, and maybe one day when she has the time and the will, we'll even have some of these episodes on her channel. So do subscribe so you guys can make sure you catch all of these episodes.
Mm-hmm. And I will have just released a Yasna video that you should all check out.
Yeah, for sure. But thank you very much, Jackie. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank all of you guys for sticking around and watching till the end. And that has been it from us for now. And we will all see you later.
Thank you, Raven, for having me, and see you guys in the next video.